Welcome to the Breakfast Leadership Show, where we interview global thought leaders on business, leadership, and life. Here's your host, keynote speaker, best-selling author, and chief burnout officer of the Breakfast Leadership Network, Michael Levitt.
Welcome back. I've got Samreen McGregor online. Hello, Samreen. How are you?
Hello. Great to be here.
Great to have you here. Really looking forward to this conversation. So why don't you share a little bit about you, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Okay. So I often find myself describing my background. I think it's been instrumental to working out who I am. I was born in Venezuela, and I moved to the UK when I was 14. My father's Indian, my mother's Venezuelan, educated in the international American system in my early years. And then I studied in the States, actually. I studied in upstate New York, Colgate University, and then did my master's in the UK after having done a couple of years of work in financial services. And well, the rest is really history. I think probably the more important part around the work I do is I'm an executive coach. It's rooted in having worked both within and outside corporate environments as a consultant, as in a number of roles, really. And the core of my work is an integration of, I would describe, three different aspects. One is strategic business performance. So I love understanding how organizations work and how businesses work, and profound behavioral change. I get a kick out of working with individuals and groups and helping them to understand themselves and what enables them to make a meaningful contribution. And then there's a third piece, which I must admit I've been honing far more recently. And this has been a result of my own personal journey, which I'm sure we'll learn a little bit about during this conversation. But it's embodied consciousness. So understanding what our bodies, not just our minds, tell us about how we're navigating life, how we're showing up in our work or in any context, like the communities that we interact with.
No, it's a great career, and obviously lots of exposure to worldly things, which really helps out because, well, we're all on the same planet, and getting the different vantage points and skill sets and education from a variety of different sources helps you be able to, adapt your own, leadership style and mimic it accordingly. And also from the executive coaching standpoint, because of that worldly experience, you can go into basically any boardroom and be able to navigate it. It might be an industry that you're not completely familiar with, but we both know that you have the framework. You can figure it out pretty quickly. So and I love how you mentioned the conscious side of things. Not that we're operating unconsciously, but it seems like so many people right now are operating in this, I don't call it a daze per se, or maybe even a funk, but just this state where things are just not clear to them, or they're not seeing clearly. Doesn't mean they're not clear depending on their situation. But what I'm finding in conversations is just people just seem to be just a bit off. And I think a lot of it has to do with what's transpired over the last few years from the pandemic. And then at the time of this recording, a lot of strife going on in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and maybe other places too that we're not being told about. But ultimately, it's been a tough go for a lot of people and organizations, and their people from top all the way to the front lines are kind of going through some things. And that obviously comes through in the leadership that we provide and the work that we do.
Oh, goodness. Wow. Yes, you've really hit a nerve there for me. And I won't repeat a lot of what you've said, because I think, you've described the backdrop, which is something that I'm finding is really important in bringing to the fore when I work with people. We are very task focused. We in the work in different, contexts, but at home and at work, and within organizations, we want to do our best to typically, I think most of us would like to do our best. And in my experience of clients, they are trying to do very hard. They're trying to do their best very much. And that task focus is an easy distraction from what's going on around us. I know that it's been very palpable recently. I don't know about, where you live, but here in the UK, we're very close to the Middle East, and the same thing happened during the time of the Ukrainian war. And it's interesting, but, the narrative starts to get infused with emotions like shame and guilt that we're not close to that, but we're spectating. But I think more recently, I'm noticing quite strong emotions, activism, and actually, it's difficult when there's splits. So that then manifests itself in our day-to-day lives. It's inevitable. And being Venezuelan, I think there is a relevance here. Over the last 20 years, we've, as a country, suffered under a very difficult regime. And I won't go into the details because it's far too complex, but I live day to day, month to month, watching my mother suffer because of her family that's still subjected to so much hardship in Venezuela, when most of our younger generations have had to flee, have had to leave Venezuela. So I really connect with those who are directly or indirectly affected through family or through connections with some of these countries. And then the narrative that gets infused in a faraway land where we're still living some of this, but clearly feeling shameful that we're not affected by it directly, certainly not the homicides at the moment that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's definitely heavy emotions. And I have people and connections that are from all the related parties, so I do my best to just kind of stay like Switzerland at best, and just like, okay, we're going to remain neutral on this. But I am not a fan of loss of life. I don't like that at all. Never have. Hopefully never will. But it really puts some strain on, obviously, like in your situation, watching your mom and, the relatives that are still, there and in your home country. And it's one of those things where when you have that going on in your life, and then you go into work, and we say, okay, time to put on our work clothes and start working. You can't segment that. You can't segment. It just, like the phrase work-life balance. You can't balance those two things. It's more harmonious. It's like work and life, you are one being. So if there's things going on in your personal life, obviously that can have a big impact on the quality of work that you have, and also just how clear things are at work. And it goes both ways. If you're having a really difficult time at work, that can impact your home life as well. So there's all these dynamics that are going on, and we're just trying to make sure that the organization stays afloat, and we're leading the organization to the best of our ability, and really continue to do the work that we need to do to transform our organizations into the next stage, whatever that looks like, because every organization obviously has had to face some really gigantic pitfalls and changes over the last few years. And I think that will continue, will continue forever, quite frankly. But I think there's a lot to be learned about resilience and learning, how to just be, as steady as she goes, as best as you can, in these ever-changing times.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, there's a dichotomy there that you describe around how do we keep afloat? How do we continue to I guess, establish conditions of stability as organizations, as leaders, as people within those environments? And equally, how do we confront the realities that might be a bit uglier and messy? And I certainly do really, really connect with that existential reality that we've been living in. And I think one of the things I've been really curious about understanding, certainly from my own life experience of having experienced traumas, both as, as a child. I think we all have versions of adversities that we may have experienced, whether it's small or big or, explicit or maybe unconscious ones that we don't even remember, and how those manifest in how we behave as human beings in our workplace or within our relationships. And this whole backdrop that you and I are describing right now adds another layer, but at a very basic level, we're still carrying that baggage and we're carrying the burden of some of those adversities.
Yeah, and that comes into the work, and when we, switch careers and or switch organizations, and yes, we're brand new into the company, but we bring our experiences and the training that we've received in the past, but sometimes we bring in our behaviors or thoughts or beliefs or expectations into an organization. And sometimes that's not fair to that organization because you haven't worked there yet, but many of us already level set, okay, this is how this organization is going to behave before we even give them a chance. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there's so many thoughts coming up for me. I had a meeting with a coaching session actually with a client just today, and it's so fresh in my mind. So I think I'll share it. It was a person who'd actually had a very, very positive experience over a long period of time within this organization, and over the last two years, she ended up moving several teams rather, and then is now reporting into a particular manager who tends to be reflecting behaviors or demonstrating behaviors that are different to what she was used to. So the culture of the organization felt far more welcoming, inclusive. There was less experience of control, and there was less need for individual seeking recognition and credibility, and status actually was a word she used. Whereas with the onset of this one particular individual, it's shifted quite a lot of those particular characteristics, and it's contaminated some of the culture. But it's also, in this particular case, we were talking about the impact it's had on her, and this particular individual has experienced some. It was coincidental that we're talking about this right now, but had experienced some abuse in her previous life, or in a previous relationship, not at work, actually, in her own life, and it was just really interesting to be her companion as she worked through the connection between how she was responding in her current environment as a result of some of the experiences, the undesirable experiences she had before, which, were very emotional, were very, very painful, actually. Now, the important part of the work was to help her try to understand it and disconnect it, and to help resource her around how to manage this particular context, and perhaps anticipate and not allow what this individual might be doing, or what the shifts in the behaviors of the team that were emerging from this change, to re-trigger her. And up until this conversation, she's felt exactly as you described. She used the word, I feel dazed, at times schizophrenic, because one moment I know what I'm doing and I know where I stand, and the next moment I'm discombobulated and don't know, I have nothing within my control. And where I've had what has felt like a fairly effective effective professional progression, I'm now really lost and feeling really disempowered. And I think that's an example of some of these undesirable effects that I certainly witness and experience in a lot of the clients I'm working with.
Yeah, I see that a lot, and I hear that a lot. And you can take somebody, and there's countless stories I could share. I think of one, a really, really successful executive or senior leader in the auto industry that I know. And this person was crushing it and doing really well. And they got a new supervisor, and it wrecked them. and where they had no confidence to do their work at all. And the only thing that's changed was just, a manager that had a different style and communication and whatnot. And I see it time and time again with, especially if there's a change in leadership, the leaders, and this, that's why there's, wonderful people like you in the world to help leaders learn how to lead, because they don't teach it anywhere. Usually when you get promoted in organizations, there isn't an additional onboarding per se. Okay, well, now you're going to be a manager. We're going to send you to manager school now so you know how to be a manager. No, they just, congratulations, here's your new title and name badge, and, go manage. And they're like, well, how, what, it's a different skill set. Then from manager to, leadership roles, same thing. Yeah, leading and managing, two different departments, people. A lot of people think, no, it's the same. It's like, no, different skills. I mean, obviously there's some skills you bring along the way, but two different viewpoints and visions and whatnot. So it catches a lot of people. So in many cases, and I have no idea about the situation with your client, but what I've seen a lot is that manager or new division lead is probably struggling personally with this role, and people react differently when they are under stress or they're afraid of something. Some of them display bullying type tactics or control. I'm the boss here, those kind of things. Some get really reserved and are afraid to make any decisions and don't respond back to inquiries. Even though they know the answer, they just get frozen and they can't. So it's always an interesting dynamic on how those things go. But healthy organizations catch it early and say, okay, let's figure this out. Not that the leader is going to be different per se, but at least more aware of how their leadership style is impacting the team, and come up with some commonalities that can learn, okay, this boss has this communication style. It's one of the things that I did whenever I'd go work for a new organization. It's like first day, that was one of the first questions, even, beyond the interview process, was asking, okay, reporting. What kind of reporting do you want from me? How frequently? What format? Do you want it in spreadsheet format, email format, written report, text message, WhatsApp? Do you want me to record a TikTok video for you? I'm being cheeky there, but what makes sense for them. So that way I'm communicating to them in a way that works for them. And then sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they say, well, how do you want me to communicate with you? And I would say usually in currency units, and they'd laugh. And then I would say, okay, whatever makes sense for you. So we don't have any pitfalls or things fall through the cracks. I'd much rather be prepared, know what I need to work on, schedule touch base meetings, and away you go. But a lot of organizations don't even do that. And that is a simple thing to implement. Obviously, the deeper dive, of course, and this is when you're working with an individual or a team. There's a lot to unpack sometimes, because it's not just a thing. There's just a lot of things to dig up to figure out, okay, what's causing this team to collapse or have high turnover, or why is performance down 25% this quarter? There's a lot of things to dig into.
Oh, hugely. And I think what I hear you describe is just basic contracting skills. How do you contract with a new colleague, a new manager, a new boss? And equally, there are multiple layers to that contracting process. And I think one of the personal reflections I have is if I go back about 13, 14 years, I was a client director in a consultancy startup. And it was a really enlightening moment in time. It was probably one of my least favorite moments, darkest periods, and it was a great place to work, generally speaking, but there were some micro moments and micro aspects to the relationships with various people within that particular constellation I was working in. And I learned I was going to say very quickly, but actually I learned in a quite painful way. And I probably reflected on this about 6 years later and realized and saw the connection that I had this particular need to be recognized and to receive external validation from others. And as a senior leader myself, I was on the leadership team. I noticed that I would go above and beyond the call of duty of what I was expected to do. And I see this a lot with a lot of the work that I do with clients as well, is some of those expectations are totally felt but not seen. And it's not until we actually take the time to look in the mirror, to spend some time getting to know exactly what is at the root of that need for recognition and validation. Where does it come from? And to paint a story, and whether the story is 100% accurate or fully representative, it doesn't really matter. What's most important is connecting the dots and understanding how that story has influenced some of the tendencies that we have. During that contracting process, it would mean being more assertive, being more bold, being more clear about my needs. But without some of that understanding of what drives some of that need for recognition and validation, which is external, I would be reinforcing that. 13, 14 years later, I now understand it. And I'm very clear on my boundaries. But as you said, I think it is, and I feel I'm in a profession where I have access to all this stuff. It's I'm surrounded by amazing mentors, and I reach out to experts in management development training and leadership development training myself, because I've got to. But what percentage of managers and leaders have access to that kind of insight and work?
Yeah, very small percentage. And one of the things that you had mentioned that I want to highlight is you're going above and beyond. Intrinsically speaking, that's a good thing to do. But you mentioned something, it's like it was felt but not seen. And that's where you have to be bold and say, look what I'm doing, look what I'm doing, look what I'm doing. Not from a, boastful per se, but maybe depending on your personality and your style. If you're not normally boastful, maybe be a little boastful. You got to, basically pat yourself on the back and make sure that people are aware of it. Because when you give more value to an organization, the right healthy ones will recognize that. If not, somebody will. And it may mean that you move along and you take a promotion with another organization, or potentially you could stay with that one if it's an organization that values growth within and retention and whatnot. But it's a situation where, and you said the key word, boundaries. You have to do it, but within your own strength and your own well-being. Don't burn yourself out trying to impress somebody, because, well, then if you're burned out, you're not producing well, and then you're going to have a domino effect, and they may say, you know what, they're not just not delivering like they used to. It's like, instead of asking you what's going on, let's say, maybe we need to forego that promotion that we were thinking about giving them and give it to this other person. And then all of a sudden that employee is like, wait a minute, I've been looking at that promotion for 4 years. I thought I was a shoo-in. And it just creates this, again, really horrible situation for somebody that could have been really good, but because of nuances, communication, and other things that are in organizations that we see day after day after day, it poisons the water, and it really makes it really problematic for these organizations and individuals to thrive.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that really stood out for me when you said, just in relation to my example, is that potential for burnout or that potential for, going beyond boundaries or unset boundaries, let's put it. And I think one of my biggest learnings, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, mainly because my son, who's now 15, actually 16, he turned 16 last week and I've forgotten already. Don't tell him that. Nearly 7 years ago, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor and went through a pediatric cancer journey. And so did we as a family. It wasn't until we were in that journey and on the other side of it that I've truly understood what boundaries are, if I'm honest. It's that life experience that does give us perspective, and certainly it has done for me. And one of the things I want to add to that is that, as a perimenopausal woman, heading to my 50s, I'm nearly there. I'm noticing, the autoimmune disease that's manifesting as a result of the stress. I'm noticing the joint pains that I'm experiencing either from the perimenopausal symptoms or the autoimmune disease. And I'm also noticing just the fatigue. And it's been because of that physiological journey that we did as a family and that I've done as a mother. And I guess the privilege to reflect on what's okay and what isn't okay. But also not to blame the system around me and to take responsibility for what are the things I should be taking some control over, or certainly making informed choices about, rather than allowing some of these tendencies and patterns from the past to dominate and to allow me to sleepwalk through life. It's because of those realizations that I've learned to set those boundaries and manage them really mindfully, really consciously, to come back to that word.
That's important work that you have done and are doing, and I commend you for discovering those boundaries. And I love that, the privilege of knowing what's okay for you and what's not. That is such important words for everyone to follow, because when you do say yes to things, then they're getting the best version of you, not the wiped out, tired, fatigued, lack of sleep and energy, although we might still have it, but we're still engaged in it. But having those boundaries are so critically important. So I could talk with you for about 6 days for sure, straight, about all these things, but where can people find out more about you and all this amazing work you're doing?
Thank you. And thank you for having me, Michael. It's been a really interesting conversation. So there's a website, I think is probably the first port of call, or you can follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram. But the website is leaderawakened.co.uk. It's also under my company brand, which is turmericgroup.co.uk. And on LinkedIn, there's an @LeaderAwakened, which is the name of my book, by the way. It's a pretty practical but deep coaching companion for anyone who wants to do this kind of work. If you've been inspired by some of the examples that we discussed today, and @LeaderAwakened is also on Instagram, and you can read more and see more of the concepts and the topics in both those channels.
Awesome. And I'll definitely have that information in the show notes. So thank you again for your time today. Really appreciating our conversation. I learned a lot. I've already took a bunch of notes, which I don't do often on a show, but there's a notepad full of notes here. So I really appreciate you and all the gold that you gave us today. So thanks again for being on the show.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Breakfast Leadership Show, part of the Breakfast Leadership Network. Visit breakfastleadership.com for tips on empowering your business and your life.